Trump has this idea, sort of what I call fantasy Russia. He loves the idea of a really strong leader who locks up his opponents, who has really seriously big palaces, not like that poky little White House, and who attracts sort of worldwide respect, particularly having come from a position where the country was flat on its back. So Putin has, in Trump's eyes, made Russia great again, rather as Trump would like to make America great again. And there's a kind of naive enthusiasm there, which is immune to facts.
One of the things that Donald Trump's been saying when he talks about ceasefires and peace agreements and everything else is he talks about the casualties. What do you think he's likely to say or do whenever this 1 million figure is announced? And whilst Western intelligence has at times disagreed with and these numbers have come from the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, I should have said, but Western intelligence has sometimes disagreed with Ukrainian Ministry of Defense assessments, but actually over recent months, in fact, over the past year or so, increasingly it's come together and supported the numbers that are coming out there. The number's huge. What do you think Trump's going to say?
Well, of course, there's another deadline, which is not the reaching the 1 million. It's Trump's 14 days, and he said within 14 days he wanted to Putin to come to the table with some serious proposals for peace, and that hasn't happened. And I think what we really see is that Trump is either unwilling or incapable of putting actual pressure on Putin. He's quite capable of saying he wants the fighting to stop. He comes out with these slightly sort of pathetic remarks about how the bloodshed is terrible, and he's a president who wants peace and so on. But you only really get peace when there is a political geometry behind a conflict that means that both sides stop fighting. And for Russia, that would mean that Russia would have to think that the conflict's going seriously in the wrong direction and they better stop fighting before it gets any worse. That can only come really through Ukrainian pressure on the battlefield and massive economic and other pressure in the rest of the world. Both of those rely on the United States, and in both cases the United States is not doing it. So I'm afraid that we are in a very difficult position now with Trump, and he's I think exposed now his unwillingness to intervene, and we have to pick up the consequences.
Do you think Trump's preparing to walk away? Do you think it's falling into the all too difficult bracket for him and he's going to go, I've got other things to deal with? Ukraine, you're on your own. Europe, sort him out?
I think that Trump's attention span's quite short, and we've seen a dizzying array of foreign policy priorities from the Gaza Riviera through to Greenland via Panama, Canada, and many other things, and there'll probably be more to come. The Ukraine, I think, is not a huge priority for him. He promised to get it fixed quickly. That hasn't worked. He's willing to blame both sides in a sort of rather petulant way. But I do think that there's an underlying priority for him, which he wants to make friends with Putin. And he's willing to do that over the heads of the Ukrainians and over the heads of the Europeans. And that's one of the very few consistent points in his foreign policy, and that's very worrying.
Well, if you look at the Russian economy and you compare it to the European economy, where he doesn't want to be friends with the EU, and you look at other economies, why do you think it is Trump is fixated on making friends with Putin and doing business deals? It doesn't seem logical if you just look at the straight numbers on paper.
You're absolutely right. The Russian economy is about the size of Italy, and what it produces in form of energy is actually pretty much a competitor to the United States rather than a complement. It's not as if Russia was the source of fantastic high-tech goodies that would help make the American economy competitive if only they could get rid of sanctions. Not a bit of it. The relaxing sanctions would increase Russian oil production, and that would not be I think great for the American oil and gas industry, among other things. But anyway, that's beside the point. Trump has this idea, sort of what I call fantasy Russia. He loves the idea of a really strong leader who locks up his opponents, who has really seriously big palaces, not like that poky little White House, and who attract sort of worldwide respect, particularly having come from a position where the country was flat on its back. So Putin has, in Trump's eyes, made Russia great again, rather as Trump would like to make America great again. And there's a kind of naive enthusiasm there, which is immune to facts. Actually, the key thing for the United States is to make friends with Europe, or to repair its relationship with Europe, because the United States and Europe together is 1 billion people, and you can add in some other allies and you quite quickly get up to 1.5 or even 2 billion. And that is a serious counterweight to China. And if you were looking at this in a sort of from a geostrategic or geoeconomic point of view, you would say, let the rich democracies stick together tightly and they can be dictate pretty good negotiating terms to the rest of the world. But that's not the way Trump sees it. Trump sees his allies as rivals and his enemies as potential friends. And that is a very difficult position for us.
Well, they do say keep your friends close and keep your enemies closer. But, it seems as if what you're saying is it's all down to an envy that Putin can continue to rule like a dictator for as long as he wants. That would be quite worrying if Trump had the same ideas.
Yes, I think there's a strange tension between the sort of fantasy Russia that lives in President Trump's head and the bleakly realistic view of the West, which is in Putin's head. And although Putin is in some ways quite ill-informed about things and has a sort of conspiratorial view of the world, he does see pretty clearly, I think, where the West's weaknesses are, and he sees a pretty clear way of exploiting them, and he's pretty systematic about doing it. And so we are, on the one side, you have this sort of Disneyfied version of geopolitics in the White House. And on the other hand, you have an extremely bleak and pragmatic one in the shrewd brains of the Kremlin.
Now, getting back into Ukraine, every time we think Ukraine's on the back foot, and global commentators seem to focus on the movement of the front line. The Russians have advanced 10 meters, therefore they must be winning. But actually, we look at what Ukraine's doing with Operation Spider's Web, that very audacious drone attack against Russian strategic bomber airfields. Then there was another one that didn't quite get the same headlines, which used drones to attack coming out of grain trucks on a train that was carrying lots of military equipment that destroyed about a regiment's worth of equipment. Then we saw the Kerch Bridge being attacked again, and we're getting daily reports of Ukraine successfully attacking Russian defense industries and elsewhere. They seem to have backed off a little bit from the oil refineries that they were successfully attacking. Do you think this is making a big difference? And do you think it's this operational level of war that is going to dictate the outcome at the end of the day?
I think it makes a big difference. I'd be careful about saying it makes a decisive difference. I think that Russia, as we said at the beginning, takes a different attitude to casualties, whether they're human or physical. It's a very big place. There's massive redundancy, and you lose a railway bridge here and a regiment's worth of equipment there and an oil refinery somewhere else. And these are losses that to a Western country would be devastating, would have people thinking, why are we doing this? And we need to rethink. And in Russia, it's just sucked up, I'm afraid. I think that the key variable in this is not the way the front line moves, it's the quantity and quality of Ukrainian air defences. And here we have an extremely worrying and significant move that Trump is apparently diverting vital components that the Ukrainians need for their air defences to other destinations. He's actually mocked the Ukrainians publicly for their request to buy, not for donations, to buy Patriots. And so we have a serious problem looming in the Ukrainian ability to defend their cities from these Russian attacks, which are growing in quantity. The Russians are producing very large numbers of drones, which can swamp Ukraine, or saturate Ukrainian air defences, leaving the way clear for the smaller number they have, although there's also significant numbers of ballistic missiles. And that is a strategic vulnerability for Ukraine, and it's going to be very difficult, although not impossible, but very difficult for the Europeans to fill the gap left by the United States.
Talking to the Europeans and filling that gap, we had Mark Rutte, the NATO Secretary General, in London yesterday, and made a very robust speech talking about how the new NATO target for member countries would be 5% of GDP spent on defence, split 3.5% directly on defence and 1.5% on other stuff not really defined. This leaves the UK in a difficult position where the Strategic Defence Review has got an aspiration to get to 3% sometime maybe in the next Parliament if the conditions are right. And Rachel Reeves today is putting out her spending review and likely to be giving billions more to defence. Do you think that the UK's leading role in NATO and that's and its bridge to the US and US's expected leadership from the UK is in jeopardy if we stick to 3% and don't go to, at least a public statement of 3.5 with an aim to get to 5?
I think that the UK's leading role in NATO exists mainly in our own heads and not in the heads of our allies. Unfortunately, we've systematically failed to deliver to NATO what we've promised over a period of many years. And although we have some extremely impressive niche capabilities, we have some very good senior officers, we have fantastic special forces, we have the nuclear deterrent and some other high-end, high-tech things. The disappointment in NATO over the last 10, 15 years towards Britain is palpable. We've promised to field a warfighting division. We can't. We are struggling to maintain 1,000 troops in Estonia. Our role in the Joint Expeditionary Force, which is not exactly NATO, but includes our most important NATO allies, is again conspicuous by its absence, and we're supposed to lead that. So I think it's going to require very serious recapitalisation of our armed forces and some tough choices on priorities to regain that role in NATO, which we aspire to and to some extent may even believe we still have. I think also the huge question marks over the role of the United States in NATO means that if we are supposed to be the Trump whisperers who can deliver Trump an American combat power in Europe, well, we're going to need to prove we can do that, because what we hear at the moment in Europe is a vast sucking sound of the Americans dismantling and degrading their capabilities. They're not going to leave Europe, but the willingness to fight for Europe and the perception in Russian minds that Americans are going to fight for Europe is diminishing. And so that also affects British prestige. And conversely, I think countries like France are becoming much more important.
You've been watching Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. If you want to get access to exclusive content, please sign up for Times Radio membership and subscribe. Right, 3, 2, 1. You've been watching Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. If you'd like access to exclusive content, please subscribe to Times Radio membership and watch us on YouTube. But you can now get us as a podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. And don't forget, you can also listen to Times Radio for the latest updates on global affairs and read about them at thetimes.com. Thank you.